Hi there students, in this video I'm going to give you an overview to absolutism and this particular approach to government, this particular approach to the role of the king or the role of a ruler. People tend to think that king implies absolute power and that we can go all the way back through history, and whenever a king said something it was absolutely what they wanted and they always got absolutely what they wanted. But this is not actually true, and it doesn't take into account how difficult it is to govern a kingdom, especially without modern technology. In fact, the modern state probably has more control over our own day-to-day lives than an earlier kingdom, than a pre-modern kingdom. And medieval kings and queens were in particular kept in control or restricted in the amount of power they could exercise by two important factors in medieval society: the nobles and the church. The nobles, even if a significant portion of them, not all of them, gathered their armies together, they were more powerful than the king. If the church disapproved of a king's action, disapproved of a king or a queen's action, they could legitimate the subjects rising up against the monarch, they could legitimate another country invading the kingdom. And so we find that medieval kings have to use a certain amount of subtlety in exercising their power. They have to have at least most of the nobles on board, and generally they have to have the church on board as well. You can kind of get away with only having the support of one, but if you lose the support of both for a long period of time, you're probably not going to survive as a king. And everyone really knew this, everyone who was politically involved. Now, this starts to change in the 15th century because these checks on the powers of medieval monarchs are weakened. Firstly, the power of the nobles is weakened. That's because in the 15th century, we see a series of very destructive civil wars, and wars that are waged in other countries around Europe that aren't necessarily civil wars, but which are waged because the power of the king or the queen is weak. And so people start to get tired of these civil wars. They start to get tired of these nobles fighting each other. They want the monarch to be more powerful, to restrict the nobles from engaging in these wars, being able to put the nobles in their place when they start wanting to fight with one another. And then we have the scandals in the papacy, and we have the Protestant Reformation. This means that papal influence is marginalized in society, and then it means that if the church disapproves of what you're doing, you have other church options as a ruler who you can turn to. And so the churches actually more need your support than you need theirs. And so rulers are becoming more powerful. And at the same time, people are getting tired of these ongoing wars. And then the 30 Years' War kind of puts an exclamation mark on all of this. Millions of people die as a result of this war, and we find political theorists arguing that these wars need not happen if we have powerful rulers. And one of the political philosophers to argue this was Thomas Hobbes. He wrote a book called Leviathan, in which he said human beings aren't naturally social. Naturally, they fight and compete with one another. And this was something new. Up until this point, most people have said humans are most naturally happy, most naturally fulfilled when they're living in community with one another. But Hobbes says, no, that's not the case. He says society is unnatural. It's unnatural for humans to live together. And so every now and then, what human beings are really like, which is competitive and aggressive beings, that will rise to the surface. And so we need a powerful sovereign who controls both the church and local political organizations to try and keep things as peaceful as possible. And everyone must surrender all their rights to the sovereign so the sovereign can keep them safe. And this is the theoretical premise of absolutism. If you give a ruler absolute power, conflict within your kingdom will be minimized and you will be more safe overall. And we see this best exemplified, best put into practice in the Kingdom of France, which, if you will remember, I explained at the end of the Reformation, at the end of the civil wars between the Huguenots and the Catholics in France, that are fought about religion, or at least partly fought about religion. We find that the Kingdom of France is centralizing its authority anyway. And Louis XIV is the monarch who does this the best. He's 5 years old when he becomes king. He has a difficult childhood because he's constantly a pawn in the plotting and the wars of the nobles in his kingdom. And so when he turns 18, he already has this mission to become totally independent of the nobles and to rule on his own. And one of the ways that he does this is by building the Palace of Versailles. He builds this giant, luxurious palace in Versailles, outside of Paris. If the nobles want to see him, they have to come to him. So the nobles are coming to him. That already puts them in a subservient role. And he ties the tax breaks that nobles typically got to them performing ceremonial roles in the palace. And so now the nobles are leaving their local lands where they're extremely powerful, where they could go back and raise armies and plot against the king. And instead they're in Versailles, where he can keep an eye on them, and where their ceremonial roles are all bound up with serving the king and emphasizing that the king is their superior. And so this is the way that Louis gains control of the nobles. And he also gains control of the church. He threatens to break away from the Catholic Church just in the same way that Henry VIII did, and in consequence receives concessions from the papacy. Concessions that the Pope will still choose the bishops, but they'll be nominated by the king. But of course, the bishops that the king nominates, or the candidates that the king nominates, they'll be the ones that are chosen. And that bishops have to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. So now he controls both the nobles and he controls the church. And we see something similar in England. When the Tudor dynasty came to an end, Tudor dynasty, which of course had taken on the role of controlling religion in the kingdom as well as politics. When the Tudor dynasty comes to an end, Elizabeth is succeeded by her cousin James I, already the King of Scotland, who was Mary's son. James I becomes the ruler of England, and he is an absolutist. He believes that the king should be judged by no one except by God. And he's succeeded by his son, Charles I, who's also an absolutist. And we find that there is resistance to this absolutist monarchy that's developing in England. And we see it come to a head around revenue. How would a ruler raise revenue at this time? They would raise it through revenues from their own lands. The rents or whatever was owed to the king would be paid to them, and they would use that to fund their armies. If they want to raise money from all their subjects, they have to have taxes approved by Parliament. This was at least the case in England. And towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, as England starts to become a more prominent figure on the world stage, we find that they are that the kings, queens, Elizabeth I in this case, requires more money to govern England's colonies in the New World, to fight against the Spanish, and so more and more she turns to Parliament. And Parliament is able to exact concessions from the Queen. You want us to raise revenues, you need to do such and such for us. And Parliament's become used to this. And there's the development of this idea that Parliament represents the people. And James I and Charles I, who come after Elizabeth, are going to try and rule independently from Parliament. But because England is becoming this world power with responsibilities outside of England, or at least with ambitions outside of England, they find that they run out of money. And they try and find ways to raise money without consulting Parliament. Parliament becomes more resentful. And in the end, we find that Parliament, there's a point where Charles is facing a rebellion. and he doesn't have the money to put down the rebellion, so he has to call Parliament into session. And Parliament says, we're going to come into session, but we want some concessions. We want to know that you're going to call us into session regularly, not just when it's convenient to you, and that we're going to have some kind of control over royal finances. And Charles doesn't like this, and so he invades the Parliament building, which you're not supposed to do, with soldiers to try and intimidate the members of Parliament into doing what he wants. But the members of Parliament have heard that Charles is coming, and they've escaped. And so now there's war between Charles and Parliament, war between the King and Parliament, an English civil war, in which Charles is defeated by the New Model Army led by the fanatical Puritan Oliver Cromwell. So this is another aspect of the English Civil War that hopefully some of the other material this week explains to you. This is also a religious divide. In England, it's not just a political divide, it's also a religious divide. That Charles is promoting Anglicanism, and then you have Puritans in England who are, that's what we call Calvinists. That's what we call English Calvinists. They're called Puritans. And they are resistant to this religious approach, but they're also resistant to the power of the king and to those sorts of hierarchies. So that's how these two sides break down. It ends with Charles being defeated, it ends with him being executed, and England is turned into a republic for a number of years, ruled by this Puritan leader, Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell's rule and the imposition of Calvinist practices becomes so unpleasant that when he dies, no one wants to take over this role. And instead, they summon Charles I's son, Charles II, who had gone into exile and hiding, to return and to become King of England. Charles returns to England, and he's happy that he's king again. He wants to rule as king, but he doesn't want to end up like his father. So he and Parliament come to an arrangement, a power-sharing arrangement. And then this is kind of blown open when Charles dies without a legitimate heir, and his brother James II rules over England as a Catholic and begins to try and return England to being Catholic and begins to try and minimize Parliament's power again, or at least lessen it. And this leads to Parliament calling or inviting James's daughter Mary, who's a Protestant, and her husband William to come to England and seize the throne. And they do this in 1687. They're successful in overthrowing James and establishing themselves as the rulers of the kingdom. But they do so because they've been invited by Parliament. And as part of their coronation oaths, they swear that they will enforce the laws passed by Parliament. And so here in England, you see a movement against absolutism, and you see a movement in favor of Parliament. This idea that Parliament represents the people, and Parliament is the government and the legislative body. And so this is a change in the way politics is approached. This is a change in the way government power is approached that we see begin in England here. And it lines up these two models of constitutional republics and absolutist monarchies. And that debate will shape a lot of the 18th century, the next century.